Good morning, everyone. I'm Alistair Donald. I'm Associate Director at the Institute of Ideas. Welcome to the second morning of Battle of Ideas for this debate, Truth, the Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth. For the past year and more, we've been drowning in reports and commentary of post-truth, lots of articles and books, best-selling books by people like Matthew D'Ancona. But when I was preparing for this session, one thing that particularly struck me wasn't something from the past year, but a report from way back of a speech given to an academic gathering at a university. And the speaker was Charles Clarke, who was then Secretary of State for Education, New Labour Secretary of State for Education, who said his government had no interest in supporting, and I quote here, the medieval concept of a community of scholars seeking truth. And I'm raising this simply for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because while it was only last year that the Oxford English Dictionary chose post-truth as its word of the year, Clarke's comment from 14 years ago suggests that society's recent troubled relationship with truth has lasted considerably longer than a year. And hopefully we can use this session, this discussion, to go beyond the immediacy of some of the discussion of alternative facts and fake news and so on and so forth. And the second reason I raise it is because I find it very unlikely that someone like Clarke or his equivalent today would so openly cast aspersions on the truth. So hopefully, again, we can use this debate to kind of work out what has changed, what's new about the situation, how we might respond to the whole claims of post-truth and the castigation of post-truth society as well. So I'm very pleased to say that we've got a fantastic panel to help us to be able to navigate our way through all of this. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. So first up is going to be Dr. Tim Black on my immediate right. Tim's editor of Spite Review and a columnist at Spite. Very pleased that Spite have been our media partners for this debate and several others throughout the festival. I'd really recommend that you check out one of the issues of Spite Review that Tim edited earlier this year, which covers the whole issue of truth in great depth. And it's probably also worthwhile saying, actually, that Tim is a regular and often brilliant lecturer at the Academy, which is the Institute of Ideas summer school, which takes place every year. And you can find out more details about that at the Institute of Ideas website. And in fact, you can hear podcasts of lots of the lectures from recent years. Secondly, Andrew Bernstein, second from my right, author of The Capitalist Manifesto, the historic, economic and philosophic case for laissez-faire. Andrew's been a long-time affiliate of the Ayn Rand Institute, who again, I'm very pleased to say have been our partners for this debate. And he's got a PhD in philosophy, and he's got a recent novel, actually, A Dearth of Eagles, which explores the idea of the hero in a culture that rejects heroism. So check out Andrew's work. On my immediate left, third up is Steve Fuller, who's the Auguste Comte Professor of Social Epistemology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick. He's the author of more than 20 books, some of his recent work exploring the future of humanity, or Humanity 2.0, as he calls it. And particularly relevant for this session is a book that he's just written, is going to be published early next year, called Post-Truth, Knowledge is the Power Game. And you can already pre-order that book on Amazon. So do look at that and speak to Steve about it afterwards if you'd like. Fourthly, on my far right is Professor Barbara Sahakian, University of Cambridge School of Clinical Medicine. She's the co-author of Sex, Lies and Brain Scans, a fellow at the British Academy and also Academy of Medical Sciences, and a vast international reputation, lots of publications in the fields of neuropsychology, neuropsychiatry, and neuroethics. So welcome, Barbara. And finally, on my far left is Sohrab Ahmari, senior writer at Commentary magazine, regular commentator on numerous media outlets, author of The New Philistines, How Identity Politics Disfigure the Arts, which is a bite-back book, which again, I'd highly recommend. I'm very grateful to have Sohrab here just now, because he's about to move back to America and has actually delayed that move to be at Battle of Ideas Festival. So thanks for that. So, without further ado, Tim, I'm going to give them 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll be straight out for questions and discussion afterwards.
Hi. First, the idea of post-truth. I think we should almost try to look at exactly what it means. We should treat it seriously as a term. We should look at the fact it has a prefix, post, which means it is actually periodizing. It is saying that up until 2016, despite what Alice has just said, it certainly was a kind of 2016 phenomenon. Up until 2016, when the term emerges after or during Brexit and Trump, it is saying that we lived in an era of truth. And then, of course, all things changed, hence we lived in this era, or we live in this era of post-truth. Now, is that true? It certainly didn't feel like it, if you can remember life before 2016. Could Saddam Hussein, for instance, really launch weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes, as the British government said he could? There were a few really who actually believed that, outside perhaps Tony Blair and his covenant with God. Did Gordon Brown's New Labour monetary policy, his gifting, if you like, of monetary decision-making to the newly independent Bank of England, did that really realise, as he said it would, the end of boom and bust? Again, there's a lot in recent experience to say that that never actually happened. And I could go on and on and on. This was not an era of truth that we've just left. So what is being designated by this term post-truth? It's not the passing of an era of truth in the sense of some sort of revealed religion. It marks the passing, I think, of an era in which policymakers, politicians, the political elite as a whole, if you like, finding the sources of their legitimacy, the sources of their authority, withering, if you like, with the retreat of the people of the demos, which became ever sort of clearer with the hollowing out of parties and falling electoral rates. That discovering this, the political elite sought new sources of authority, new ways to authorise decision-making, to generate, or better still, I think, compel the consent of the governed. And these sources of authority were located, of course, in the idea of expertise. It allowed the idea of expertise or the use of experts, allowed politicians to say, we must do this because, of course, the experts say so. It allowed formulations such as the facts say and the science says we must do this and so on. Now, of course, the facts or the science do no such thing, not really. Climatological science, for instance, does not tell us that we must change our behaviour, that we must reduce our consumption and change our kind of consumption habits. That's a moral, political argument, if you like, using the facts, using the science to compel consent. It is the archetypal case, if you like, of politics leeching off the authority of expertise, leeching off the authority of science. So there was not an era of truth exactly, there was an era in which the semblance of truth was used and abused. In fact, I think politics, to the extent that it has any sort of relationship to truth, is properly speaking always pre-truth. I think we should talk about pre-truth politics. And I say this for two reasons. I think first because politics currency is, of course, argument, debate, and sometimes open conflict. The contention, if you like, that all men are created equal was not always self-evident. If it was self-evident, it needn't have been asserted. You don't have to endlessly say the grass is green because it's apparent that the grass is green. The idea that all men were created equal, that all men are born equal, it was an idea that had to be fought for, that had to win the argument and ultimately the consent of others. And second, I think politics is pre-truth, where I think we have to really think that politics is pre-truth because it always involves the future, our capacity, if you like, to make the future, to assert that we'd be better off nationalising sorted industries or that Brexit will revitalise democracy. They're not statements, if you like, about how things are. They're not statements that correspond to or are coherent with the structure or the nature of the world as it is. They're statements about how you think things ought to be. As Marx put it, man must prove the truth. The truth doesn't exist out there. It's something that we participate in the making of. The proof, if you like, the truth of politics, the truth of a political vision is always in the pudding. Now, Marx wasn't just talking about political truth, he was talking, as he put it, about the objectivity of human thinking in general. That is, there are not timeless truths that exist outside history and apart from us. No truth and truths emerge in history and from us. Through proving the truth, through arguing, through questioning, through struggling, through debating, through competing ideas of the truth. The argument about whether the sun is rotating around the earth or the earth rotating around the sun. Through the conflict, if you like, of points of view and differing conceptions of how the world is and how the world ought to be, something like the truth can start to emerge, but only when you start to ram the different sort of points of view and arguments together. And that, to conclude, I think is why there is a problem with truth today. It seems to be almost be caught between, on the one hand, often a blind assertion of absolutes, and I think, on the other hand, a refusal to tolerate certain debates, to refuse to accept that certain orthodoxies should be challenged. And I think that what happens then is you almost have debate, you have argument, you have the conflict between points of view at a standstill. And at that point, I think you start to have something that looks like relativism, which I think is where we are at now too often. That's my point.
So, Andrew.
Hi. I'm a writer, but I support myself as a philosophy professor, such as that is. So I've been teaching logic for 30 years, and I'm going to, in various schools in the New York area. So I'm a supporter of good old-fashioned Aristotelian logic. That truth is a conclusion supported by abundant factual evidence. Let me repeat that. I don't want to sound too pedantic, but it's an important point. Truth is a conclusion supported by abundant factual evidence. So let me take a controversial example, and I'm going to focus on the U.S. experience, but this is true in a number of Western countries, including the U.K. For example, before World War II, during World War II, and after World War II, the Soviet Union, aided and abetted by local communists, engaged in a massive espionage penetration of the U.S. government and various other Western governments. Now, there's a controversial claim. What's the evidence to support that claim? Where does it come from? Well, it's supported by numerous sources, by U.S.-born or Western-born citizens who were Soviet agents who turned state's evidence and swore under oath. It's corroborated by Soviet KGB and GRU defectors and the documents they brought with them. It's supported by research into Soviet archives that were briefly opened during the 1990s to Western researchers. It's supported by evidence from the Venona Project. Of course, during World War II, U.S. Army intelligence, distrusting Stalin, cracked the Soviet code, and for several years were able to read Soviet cables. Venona was declassified by President Clinton in 1995, by Soviet espionage officers who published post-Cold War memoirs glorifying or describing their exploits. In other words, there is a massive amount of evidence supporting the conclusion that the Soviet Union engaged in massive espionage penetration of the U.S. government. And of course, in Britain, I mean, that was true also. The Kim Philby was a notorious example in the U.K. So factual evidence in support of a conclusion, this is how you establish truth. Now, there may well be persons who are offended by this truth. And I know plenty of people who are Marxist professors or members of CP USA, the Communist Party USA, or whose family members were, and their subjective experience of communists who did not spy, were not Soviet agents, were not working for Stalin, and not supporting mass murder of the Soviet regime, their subjective experience of this is enormously painful. I understand that. And people who have a personal desire that communists should be humanitarian idealists who were not supporting Stalin's regime, by conservative estimate, murdered 20 million innocent civilians in the remorseless class warfare waged by communists, perhaps as many as 60 million, according to Professor Rudolf Rummel, murdered. So we can understand this. People have all kinds of personal desires, feelings, subjective experiences, and our emotions, our desires are important to us. They're important. But nobody's subjective experience or personal desires invalidates this factual evidence. It does not invalidate the truth that the Soviet Union, aided and abetted by local members of the Communist Party, engaged in, as I put it, massive espionage penetration of Western governments, especially the U.S. government. Truth is a conclusion supported by abundant factual evidence. This is logic, and logic never goes out of style. Now, thank you. Now, if it's true, as some people claim, that today many persons hold their conclusions in politics or elsewhere based on their personal desires and/or experiences rather than on facts and logical argumentation, then that is a very sad commentary on an epistemologically debased culture, and is a phenomenon urgently in need of reformation. Again, I'm not going to argue against anybody's personal desires or experience. There's a sacred to them. But the fact that I hold certain things as sacred does not necessarily mean that my beliefs or feelings are true. For that truth costs extra. It requires evidence. Let me conclude with a great example. For one of my heroes, Carl Sagan, the great astronomer, who's famous for the Cosmos series. Now, Professor Sagan, I think Sagan was a professor at Cornell, but Professor Sagan was one of the driving minds behind SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We're beaming out messages into the galaxy looking for intelligent life. Personally, I always thought, be careful what you look for, right? And I hope that we meet the British or American, not the German aliens, But that's a joke, by the way. I don't mean to impugn. Seriously, Germany is one of the most advanced cultures in the history of the world. I don't mean to seriously impugn Germany. But anyhow, Professor Sagan's whole career, big part of his career was bound up with the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It was important to him. This is a big part of his career. He was tremendously emotionally involved with this. But when some reporter asked him, gut feeling, Dr. Sagan, is there intelligent life out there? Professor Sagan responded, I don't think with my gut. That's two big thumbs up. We need evidence. And right now, we don't have any yet.
All right. Okay, Steve.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me start with a bit of logic as well. And I think that the way that Tim was mentioning in the first comment about the fact that in 2016, post-truth was Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year, and maybe this is why we're discussing this particular concept. And I would ask you to have a look at the definition that was given of post-truth, because I would argue that it is very much a post-truth definition of post-truth. Because what it says is, right, the people who believe in post-truth are ones who believe that, you should believe things on the basis of emotion and to disregard evidence and facts and stuff like this. And of course, what the people who come up with the definition have in mind are very specific kinds of things that they want to label as being defended on the basis of emotion and irrationality and all the rest of it. So in other words, what I mean here, and I think this is why I say it's post-truth, is that what we're talking about here with post-truth, and I hope you kind of pick up on this, is that in a sense, truth has become a much more open game than it used to be. And in a sense, those of you who would read that Oxford English Dictionary and get a sense of what the examples are, so for example, supposing you supported Brexit, supposing you supported Trump, you'd be post-truth, right, by the definition, because the assumption is that you're being driven by emotion, not evidence, you're being irrational, all the rest of it. So there's a labeling process going on, and so what you need to pay attention to is who's producing the distinction between true and false. Who's producing the distinction? This is what the post-truth condition is about. It's about saying, look, we got to look at who's exactly saying what's true and what's false. Okay? And when that comes, when you look at that, then you begin to start to think about a few things. So, for example, I don't think it's an accident that we live in times where the establishment, the elites, end up getting so defied through democratic processes. It's not because people have gone crazy or anything like this. And by the way, I say this as someone who was against Brexit and was for Hillary Clinton, okay? So let's just put that on the table. But nevertheless, one of the things that is happening now is that people nowadays are more than ever empowered to think for themselves. Not just because more people are literate, not only because more people are democratically enfranchised, but also because people have access to the internet, and frankly, our mass media is actually quite intelligent when it gets right down to it, in the sense that you have multiple options, and the point about being intelligent isn't about believing what the facts say, but rather by being in a position where there's enough different options on the table that you're forced to exercise judgment. Okay? And that's what the post-truth condition is about. It's about realizing that you can no longer trust the so-called institutions of truth, right? Which includes my own institution, the Academy, but rather there's a sense in which there's so many things being put on the table that as a result you need to think for yourself. And of course, insofar as we continue to live in a democratic society, right, you're given the responsibility to think publicly for yourself. So there's nothing to be afraid of here with regard to post-truth. In a sense, that's this kind of, one take-home message from this. And I think one of the ways you see this is that a lot of the ideas that in the past were seen as defunct very easily, in a way have kind of gotten resuscitated and have come back into play, and in a more sophisticated form. And of course, people who are part of the establishment are going to say, well, these ideas are just being presented in a more sophisticated way in order to pass a certain kind of litmus test of the establishment. But in fact, what this is doing is actually raising the level of debate generally. Right? If you look at the way we talk about creationism, the way we talk about New Age medicine, the way we talk about all these things that have been debunked in the past, it's at a much higher level of sophistication than in the past. Because people are now actually, in a way, not just taking any of these beliefs for granted, but rather thinking through things for themselves. And what that inevitably means is there's going to be conflict. And there's going to be challenges to established authority. And in a sense, the strength of a democracy is the ability to be able to withstand this. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to live with, especially those of us who are in the academy, is the fact that in the end, the fact that you have a degree in something isn't going to matter that much when there's so many different ways of getting access to information. It's not like it should be completely neglected, but it shouldn't be the last court of appeal. There should be much more of an open debate in these matters. And if I may conclude, you may know that next week is the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses, right, to the church door in Wittenberg Castle. And what he was most against with regard to the Roman Catholic Church, and this was a person who's a professor of moral theology within the church, was the selling of indulgences, the idea that you could go to heaven if you just paid enough money. And I think that in the future, university degrees are going to start to look like this, right? Unless we really do start to engage with all of the sort of stuff that's going on in the outside, that at an intellectual level is getting to a level of seriousness where academics need to take it seriously.
Okay.
Thank you.
Barbara, your thoughts.
Thank you. So as you heard, I'm a neuroscientist and a psychologist, so I'm going to approach this from a rather different way. And I think this audience might be different from a lot of members of the public because you've come here today on a Sunday morning, got yourselves up, got here, and you're willing to listen to a debate where maybe your ideas will be challenged, things that you hold dear will be addressed, and maybe you'll have to rethink them. But you're here because you're open to that kind of discussion, which perhaps makes you slightly different from some other people in the world. So I'm going to start by asking and talking about memories. Now, we all think of memories as, things that we know about very securely. We have these memories that we think are very clear in our minds, and we've got them solidified. But I want to ask the audience, we also have what's called, more social memories, or we have what's called social cognition, where our memories are formed within a social unit. And some of these are memories of our childhood. So I'm going to ask the audience, how many of you have quite vivid memories about events when you were a small child where you couldn't actually remember them yourselves, but your relatives have talked to you so much, your mom and dad or your brothers and sisters, so much about them that you feel very strongly that you've got a memory of this thing. Yeah, so that's a phenomenon that we have. We form these memories, and the nice thing about our memories is that we consolidate our memories in our sleep of different things we've learnt, or so that we can remember them. But we also have slightly labile memories, so we can reconsolidate our memories and add more things to them. And during the point of reconsolidation, of course, our memories are labile. So we can either lay down more information and make the memory stronger, or we can make the memory weaker during those times, and maybe even add false information or false material. So one thing that's happening today is that besides memories are being shared among groups through Facebook and Instagram. So it used to be that more you talk to your friends about different memories that you have, that you want to experience again, maybe re-experience. And maybe they'd clarify some things and say, oh, I don't remember it that way, I remember it this way. And as you talk, you form a memory that's a joint memory that you both kind of agree on. And that's an interesting thing that happens. And this also happens in the context of social media, so that people are sort of coming together with these memories, and then eventually they're opting for this is the definitive version of this. And at that stage, it becomes quite hard to change. Now, the slightly, or very worrying thing is that about 62% of US adults get their news from social media. So that's how they're getting their news. So they're getting news that is reformulated in some way by social groups that they have. So that sort of brings me to another point. How many of you in the audience feel that you have relatively strong opinions about things? That's great. I would have thought so. But how many of you feel that you'd be willing to reconsider your opinions if you had some good evidence or good discussion about, yeah. So that's great. So that's very different. But sometimes when these memories get consolidated in the social context of social media, they're very, very hard to change. And there's a reason for that, and it's called cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance can also, that's a sort of technical term in psychology, but it can also be thought of viewpoints. So, does this audience still read newspapers? Can I see how many? Yeah, okay. So, I mean, you don't buy different newspapers every day, do you? I mean, you tend to buy the same newspaper. And people who are looking maybe a little bit to the left, a little bit liberal, are looking at the Guardian or something like that. People who are looking to the right, a little bit conservative, are looking for the Daily Mail. So the point is that you're looking for support for some of your views, whether they be liberal or a little bit to the right, about how you view the world. And the reason that we do that is that we have this thing called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is actually mental stress or discomfort that's experienced by an individual who is confronted by new information that conflicts with existing beliefs, ideas, or values. So it sometimes makes us very uncomfortable to be hit with these new ideas that don't accord with the way that we've been thinking. And also, as been said earlier, that many people are now not being influenced by experts in a particular topic, but we're in the age of the celebrity, where celebrities might post news. There's also fake news sites, but celebrities may have opinions, or they may have interpretation of news facts, and those are taken up by groups who follow them consistently. So we're getting more and more of our information in that way. And I think in the younger age group in particular, it's especially worrying because people are being taken over by technologies and the different internets and iPhones and medias and things like that. And it's actually been talked about in a very good book called The Distracted Mind, that we have limited individual attention, and if we try to spread it broadly, we can't focus. And if we try to just focus in on one or two things, then we can't spread it broadly. And part of the reason that we're having difficulty with attention in this modern age is that we are being bombarded by so much information that we're trying to deal with that information as best we can.
Final minute, Barbara.
And so what I would say is that what we find now is that there's a thing called a fear of missing out, whereby the I generation, if you take the phones away from them for 15 minutes, they begin to experience anxiety. So being in with the in crowd and being able to express the same views as the in crowd is becoming overwhelming, I think. Thank you.
Sohrab, over to you.
Thanks to the Institute of Ideas for having me, and thank you all for being here on a Sunday morning. I was asked to bring a religious or faith-based point of view to this debate on truth and post-truth. And I have no particular qualifications in that regard. I'm not a theologian, or I'm certainly not a priest. I'm just an ink-stained wretch who happens to be, or tries to be, a faithful Roman Catholic. And so I want to start with, take you back to the year 1991, when the Soviet Union was in the process of collapse. In fact, much of it had already happened. And Saint Pope John Paul II issued an encyclical titled Centesimus Annus. And it was his attempt, having had a papacy that for most of its or his pontificate that had mostly faced east toward the Soviet Union, he was now reorienting himself to the West, having assumed spiritual leadership of the movement to defeat communist totalitarianism. And he was worried now about what happens in a world where free market democracies, certainly in 1991, looked dominant, and how to maintain a free world. And he wrote, "Freedom attains its full development only by accepting the truth. In a world without truth, freedom loses its foundation and man is exposed to the violence of passion and to manipulation, both open and hidden." Now, what he meant by truth are certain ideas about the dignity of the human person, an idea about man as being fallen, but you needn't be religious to accept that. You can look at that as a root fact of human nature, that we make mistakes, that we're prone to great evil, even as we're capable of showing tremendous grace and humanity as well. And all of it was bound up with a Judeo-Christian tradition, and as well informed by classical teaching and philosophy. So with that idea, he felt that now it's under threat in the West, the newly liberated West, on three fronts. He identified relativism as becoming the basic attitude that's meant to be most compatible with democracy. In other words, if you're a citizen of a free society, ergo you must also be a relativist and not seek for an idea of universal truth or a standard of universal justice. Those who speak the truth in an absolute sense were being shunned already, he warned. And because there was no sense of ultimate truth to politics, or as he worried, that was becoming the case, ideas were becoming manipulated by various groups. And I would say now that those warnings have come to pass. In other words, I, as someone who likes liberal democracy, I want to see this relatively decent, relatively free order that we have remain so. I worry that we're losing it. And in a way, the society that we live in, where it seems like we're just bombarded with facts and there is quite a lot of nonsense in the political sphere, is partly a result of us having lost the ultimate truth about ourselves. Which were those things? The fact that we're the products of a Judeo-Christian civilization, and you needn't have been a believer to accept that, but the West looked a certain way, believed certain things about human dignity, about the common good, because it had grown in this tradition. So now we have this flower in our hand, which is the West, and we don't know what to do with it, and it's wilting because it's been through growth of relativism and a certain kind of aggressive skepticism. It's not rooted anymore, and a lot of this I see as a failure of democratic elites over the years. As a result of, I think, their own lack of confidence about any of this. They insist on social justice, they insist on the truth, but they have no sense of rooting it in an idea of the human person. And as a result, liberal elites are becoming ever more illiberal by the day. And a lot of the growth of post-truth, I blame on people who are supposed to be stewards of truth in Western society. I'll give you a few quick examples. On the this idea of the suppression of free debate that's happening and taking place at the hands of often people who see themselves, again, as stewards of truth. Recently, the Associated Press, which is the largest news agency in the US and sets the standard for journalism, issued a certain set of guidelines that said, when you write about transgender issues, you're no longer to say that someone had a sex change, they had a sex affirmation. In other words, they were always, this person was always male or female, and the surgery ratified it in a way. Don't use he or she, use they, and the agency left the door open to using these made-up pronouns like zir and z. Now, the truth about gender, the fact that it is rooted in biology, and that there are differences between men and women that are fundamental, that can easily be changed, doesn't go away when you suppress the debate by setting the terms of it in the style guide, right? This was a style guide issued to journalists writing about gender issues. People will, no matter how much you point to someone and say men menstruate, men can become pregnant, people won't accept it, and that truth won't go away. What it will do is it will find subterranean paths to expressing itself that may not be as responsible as a Roman Catholic cardinal speaking about it. In France, I wrote about a case when I was at the Wall Street Journal, about a case of an advertisement that was directed at mothers who have fetuses diagnosed with Down syndrome. And it was just these children who had Down syndrome addressing this prospective mother and saying, I can live a happy life, I can live a dignified life, and consider not aborting me. And the French regulatory authority that oversees the television advertisement took the decision to ban that on the ground that it would be too disturbing. So a certain kind of, to women who had aborted their Down syndrome babies. So there's a certain kind of fear and insecurity on the part of democratic elites where, again, in the name of truth, a clear suppression of free speech is happening. I could go on with these kinds of cases, but the point is that that we should be much more afraid of that brand of elite post-truth because of the consequences that it can breed than the symptoms of it that we see, like nonsense on Twitter and things that some public figures tweet. There's a sort of more systematic and insidious way of suppressing the truth that should concern, again, not just people of faith, but everyone, because truth will find a way. The question is in what form it'll emerge.
Okay. I think they've all been really interesting in very different ways, those introductions, and I think there's, certain things that are conflicting in what you've said. You might you see this as an opportunity, or you're worried about suppression of the truth, and so on and so forth. So there's definitely a chance through the discussion to come back on some of the stuff that each of you come out with. But I do want to go out to the audience. Can I start over here and then work back?
So we had the papal encyclical that we must accept the truth in order to be free. I think I prefer Marx's formulation that we must prove the truth. Prove, the sense of the word prove here being test, not, you start and then you kind of demonstrate it. I can see the point of accepting the truth in order to be free. Once you know the truth, it allows you to act in the world more effectively. But the key to the idea of wanting to test your knowledge is you don't know at the start, right? I mean, this is, Francis Bacon at the beginning of science, he makes this point very effectively, that in order to get closer to the truth, the first thing you have to do is acknowledge that we don't yet know what that truth is. And, I mean, I think where I would maybe slightly disagree with Tim's take on it is the idea that what we have with the post-truth is a result of the elites just kind of trying to impose some way to make everybody behave. Because I think what's going on is a more profound problem, which is that neither the elites nor anyone else in society really believe that human beings have effective choices about how to act in the future and bring about different outcomes. And once you lose that idea that we have different possible futures that depend on how we act, all that you are left with is the possibility of saying, well, how is it? What is the truth that we must accept in the kind of papal picture, right? And so in that picture, because we've kind of lost the vocabulary of politics, when people disagree, instead of arguing that we have different choices, people are left just asserting the world is this way versus the world is that way. And that's what leads to this contention over truth, this reduction of truth to something which people battle over instead of battling over politics and how we should act. They're left asserting you're wrong on the facts. So we need to recover that possibility of political action, of choice, of different futures. And I think only when we do that we can get past some of the problems with the concept of truth.
Okay, thank you.
I loved Andrew Bernstein's points on evidence, and I feel a strong sense of affinity with it. But I think it's important to say that agreeing on what the evidence tells us wouldn't necessarily lead to any one political choice as against another political choice. So if I took the example of Mike Randall and Pat Pottle, who helped the Russian spy George Blake escape from Wormwood Scrubs, those two anarchist peace activists were well aware of the spying, and they knew that he was a spy, and they chose to spring him from prison. Years later, though it was common knowledge that they'd done it, they admitted it in print and they were prosecuted, and the judge instructed the jury to find them guilty of helping in the escape. And Mike Randall made a speech from the dock, and he said, you have been instructed by the judge, but you are a jury and you are here to make a choice. We don't deny the evidence, but we're asking you to find in our favour because what we did was the right thing to do. Now, the jury blatantly chose to ignore the evidence or to set the evidence aside or to draw a different conclusion from the evidence, and at Mike Randall and Pat Pottle's invitation decided to acquit them, which I think was contentious, but you can see their point.
Sorry, thank you. I'd like to ask a Sorab a question because he's speaking on behalf of religion. I don't necessarily want to comment on specifically the Roman Catholic religion, but because you could say all the major religions have this view. But the question about truth is, from a religious point of view, is sort of almost what comes from God. And you might turn around and say from a Roman Catholic or from other major religions and say that something like saying like homosexuality is immoral, and therefore, because God said so, it's a truth. So the question is someone like me, Professor Bernstein might look to his hero Ayn Rand and say something like, as what Ayn Rand said to William Buckley, you're far too intelligent to believe in God. And they could say something like, believing in God is irrational. And then comes down to a question whether your truth is a good truth or whether it's irrational. And if it's irrational, then the question is it's not truth? And somebody could look at it in a completely different way. So if it's sort of almost like a Kantian deontological type method of truth, then who is the deon? Who is a person, or what is it that is going to determine what is objective truth, if you like. And then it comes down to the question is, and I do accept from a religious point of view, that the God idea is a very, very strong argument. But other people who don't necessarily believe in God will come against that. And I just wondered if you can sort of comment or maybe defend God and someone that might want to oppose it.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just a slight worry about the way you're perhaps expressing some of the ideas, Barbara, on things like cognitive dissonance. I just wondered why it is assumed that a new idea or something that challenges the way you think would be experienced as discomforting rather than exhilarating or exciting and possibly transformative in a positive way. I don't see, I think there's a prior assumption there that I find a bit worrying. You know, this, the idea of people not being able to cope with so much information, couldn't that also partly be because so much of the information is so rubbish or so inconsequential? So it's, you know, people just don't engage with it because it isn't really worth engaging with. And that thing about worth engaging with brings me to my main question, which is, Tim, I love the way you described the need to arrive at the truth rather than kind of finding it as a sort of a concrete object given and determined. But I do wonder, because I've just come from a philosophy of education conference, right, where I've had the academics, this links in with what you were saying, Saurabh, saying, well, what we really need is a non-representational epistemology and a non-epistemological pedagogy, which you think, so that means the teacher just stands there and does nothing in the classroom. And whereas what kind of an epistemology has no representational, anyway, but the point is, you get my idea, is the what. What do you, I'd like to know from the panel, I suppose, where you see the question of knowledge or differentiations in types of knowledge, and whether that has a role in, what role it has in arriving at the truth in politics and in academia.
Okay, so Tim, there's a couple of things I think for you to come back on, then we'll go to Barbara, because I think you need to answer that, and then we'll come over to this side and Andrew pick up. So Tim, do you want to come back first?
Just a quick clarification. I didn't, perhaps it came across that way, I didn't mean to argue that truth, or the idea of truth, or the authority of the experts or the facts were being used to control people. I'd say more broadly, I don't think the political elite or the political class is evil or manipulative or sort of brainwashing in that way. I think it's far more sort of incompetent than that. I don't think they'd be capable of organising some sort of mass sort of brainwashing or even some large-scale mind control program. I was just trying to suggest that they would use it in the absence of, or in the midst of a kind of crisis of legitimacy, in the absence of what ought to be the sources of authority in a democratic society, namely democratic consent. They sought, or they looked for, and used the authority of the science in its place, and that was a massive problem, because of course scientists and science and experts and expertise, it's all incredibly valuable, but within its field. I think when you start to make the science do something that it's incapable of doing, which is to tell people how to live, it undermines both sides of that. It undermines the science, and I think it obviously undermines anything like a sort of democratic politics. I think it came up, I think, in Andrew's introduction and Saurabh's as well. I think it's this idea of emotivism, which Alistair MacIntyre talks about in After Virtue, which, Alistair MacIntyre's contention is that, thanks to the Enlightenment, a kind of Judeo-Christian, Aristotelian moral framework collapsed, and we still sort of have fragments of it knocking around, but there is no shared moral language. There is no shared kind of moral system in which we are able to sort of make sense of our own activity and make sense of the world. And in its place, he says, you just have people asserting their feelings. And And actually, that is a problem. The idea that the authority for your own actions and your own beliefs, the authority for your arguments comes not from your ability to present a reasoned case, but from the sheer depth of your feeling and how you feel is a problem. And it's a problem because it's endorsed. You are encouraged to respect the feelings of another, which means you don't engage exactly with what they're saying, which becomes a massive problem. And you could even say that it almost culminates in this strange cloud of thinking around trans politics and transgenderism, whereby the idea that someone can say, I feel like a man in a woman's body, because you've authorised feelings to such an extent, it means that can't even be challenged, and it leads to huge problems.
Barbara, do you want to come back to the question that was directly put to you?
Sure, yes. Well, thank you for that great question, or statement, in fact. And obviously, as an educator, I find new ideas very exciting, and I'm sure this audience does as well. But you have to remember that excitement and stress are quite close together, so that it's excitement and positive until it gets too much, and then it gets aversive and it becomes stress. And so it's often said to me, like, I love coming out here and hearing what everybody's got to say and engaging with you all to hear what your viewpoints are and how they differ from mine. But a lot of people would say, I could never sit up there and give a talk. I'd find it too stressful. So I think in this context too, we're talking about quite firmly held beliefs. It's a bit like what people say at the dinner parties: don't discuss religion or politics, because if you come up against somebody who has the opposite idea to your own beliefs, it can become quite heated or stressful discussion. So I appreciate what you're saying, and I think there are people who want to take on new ideas, but sometimes if they're challenging very strongly held views or ingrained beliefs, it's quite difficult. I also just wanted to make the point that social cognition is often guided by the dominance of a really charismatic leader, or as they call them these days, which could be a politician or a celebrity. So once somebody who's dominant starts to get a group together and they're thinking the same way, you probably remember from school days that you can either be in that in-group or in the out-group, and it can be very unpleasant to be in the out-group.
Okay. So
Can I just make one more point?
To get,
just
well,
one quick
very
point,
quickly, because I want to move on.
I mean, I would, as a scientist, I would prefer to talk about facts and the interpretation of facts and not truth, because you can have false memories and believe it very strongly, but it's not the truth. And there are different interpretations of facts.
Okay, so I'd be interested in what the audience thinks about that. Andrew, you've got something.
Yes.
Just quickly, because
The question of moral philosophy is, what is the good? The question of political philosophy is, what is the good society? The question is, good by what standard? So going back to that example, somebody might spy for the Soviets, might even know that Stalin's regime was murderous. The standard of value then in deciding that spying for the Soviet Union was good would not be protection of innocent human lives or individuals' right to his or her own life. The standard of value would probably be the creation of an equal society, a society where everybody's equal. This is the good, and if we have to murder a few million bourgeoisie, then so be it. But we need a standard of moral value, and that doesn't come direct from observational. I will take that back. You're probably familiar with Hume's argument here. To me, the proper standard of moral value is the requirements of human life on Earth, the factual requirements of human life on Earth. Supporting human life is the good. That which harms or undermines human life is the evil. This is why I oppose National Socialism, communism, jihadist Islam, and these various murderers. Just common criminals, the Ku Klux Klan or any other murderers.
Okay, so Steve.
Okay.
The knowledge thing, I think.
Let me start on a positive note. Well, no, because the first speaker was right on the money. and I hope we don't lose what he said in the process. But the idea of a belief in freedom of choice is necessary because we're fallible beings, and we have to believe that in some sense we have options, we have to make decisions, and then we move over time. What I would say is, though, this is not a belief that needs to be recovered. This is a belief that we're, in fact, moving toward. And this is where democracy actually makes a difference, and the fact that there are more options for putting forward different views, and people are forced to actually argue things out in a much more intense and detailed way than they have had to do in the past with more people, is a good thing that moves in that direction. And this is why I find the appeal to the idea of emotivism and emotion entirely self-serving by the people who lodge these claims, because we're having heated debate. We're being emotional here, right? And we're the rational people, right? So there's a sense in which the use of the word emotion is very prejudicial, okay? And so don't take it at face value, whatever else you do, especially given the intelligence of the people that, you know, we're talking about here. I mean, we don't live in the 17th century anymore, right? Insofar as you believe there's been any kind of progress, you have to sort of operate on the assumption that maybe a lot of our fundamental institutionalized notions of how knowledge is produced and how knowledge is presented are wrong now that we've got all of these people out there who are educated and literate and are able to access the internet and able to make choices for themselves and vote in elections. I mean, it's going to be a painful process, especially for the elites, okay? But nevertheless, it seems to me that we have to take that possibility seriously.
Okay. So, Sora, pick up on one of those things and then
Yes.
come back to some of them later.
Well, first of all, I mean, I do want to start with Steve's point, which is, yeah, I welcome the fact that there's much greater literacy. I welcome the fact that more people have the opportunity to share their views online and access news. The question is that just because lots of people feel certain things and are pulled in this and that direction, whether or not they can reach at the good, as Andrew might put it, or at the truth, or whether truth and the good lie elsewhere, not in mass feelings. Certainly, I think there's a respectable Western...
Mass feelings. This is not mass feelings. You're mischaracterizing what's going on.
Well, let me finish.
Sorry.
But to a larger point, I think a lot of folks, the gentleman over there, my friend Michael, you know, said, you know, you pose religion, where do you get your facts, or in essence, and the moral conclusions that you draw from that, do they have any basis? And I would say two things. One is, certainly today, you're much more likely to encounter faithful Jews, Christians, and others who will say that there is a possibility of universal truth and universal standards of the human good, of what's behind human flourishing, what is the common good, what is the aims of justice, than you will among the kind of positivistic or relativists and various others who say that there is no truth. Truth is what various communities have developed among themselves, or just the truth of the person in his or her own pure subjective sense. And at the same time, though, they clamor for social justice, right? They say, this thing aggrieved me, I felt bad about it, and therefore it should be suppressed out of the public square. And you say, okay, well, where do you get your standard of justice? Purely myself or my community. So, look, John Paul II always said, the church never imposes, always only proposes. Right now, at least as far as people of faith are concerned, it's just to be allowed to propose our ideas. I can go down more cases. Just now, a University of Sheffield social work student was expelled from his course because he wrote on Facebook that he believes gay marriage to be sinful. Man, I'm so lucky that I didn't grow up in that age, or that I'm not going through college right now, and a bit more of a tolerant age. That's in the name of liberalism, that's in the name of justice, but there's no standard of justice other than what he said would hurt people's feelings. I don't think it's the church that stands for irrational things right now.
Yeah. So I think there is an interesting discussion in this about whether we're opening up discussion or whether the anti-post-truth thing is shutting it down. So we can come back to that. But I want to come back out to the audience again, because I know there's lots of hands.
So my concern when we're talking about truth is, I don't know, maybe on a more superficial level, or at least in a different way, it's about telling the truth. And for me, the opposite of telling the truth is telling a lie. And I have seen how the President of the United States has been able to tell lie after lie after lie, and not to mention, you know, the promulgation of lies in social media, such as, you know, the Russian infiltration of Facebook and Twitter and so on, promulgating untruths, promulgating lies, that people who want to believe those things believe them because they're out there now in the media. So yeah, that has to be true, right? And you know, the concern I have is that then people who have opposing truth, you know, the massive evidence that you've been talking about, they aren't believed, because here's the truth, right? That's what I'm being told in my echo chamber. And so it's tearing down the ability of people to actually decipher what is the truth because of these, because they put their faith in truth that isn't the truth. I hope I've expressed that appropriately, but I think it's a danger to our society now that there isn't this way to say to people, oh no, and I don't know why this doesn't happen, that Trump will say one thing totally, you know, in contradiction to what he said the day before, or maybe that morning, but that doesn't come up to these people who want to believe whatever he has massively overtaken the social media.
Okay, thank you.
It goes back to Professor Fuller's remarks, where he ended by welcoming free and open debate, but it seemed earlier in his, he made assertions that people who voted Brexit and for Trump might be voting emotionally rather than rationally, and I think there's a problem with that. That it's
yes, exactly.
It's lazy and dismissive.
Exactly.
And once you say that people are voting emotionally rather than rationally, then you fail to. It closes down debate because there's no point in talking to them.
I agree with you 100%.
Okay. Misunderstanding.
Yeah, no, I'm actually on your side on this issue. Maybe the only person on the panel on your side.
Okay. Right, okay.
You can tease that one out.
No, because I want you to be clear about that.
No, but
sorry.
Go on, finish your point.
And that is the way that it undermines democracy if you discount half the electorate because you think that they're voting emotionally. Yes. So I voted Brexit and voted rationally, and I've lost friends. There's people who I had more friends before the EU referendum. So I voted rationally.
Okay. I agree, 100%.
Okay.
So I thought when you were talking about 90s politics, the sense of confusing a lack of transparency in prior politicians with lying, and not exploring that distinction enough has led to a situation where the public can't see the line between a lack of transparency and politicians today acting as though there is no rational truth at all. And also I think generally, you particularly, but in a lot of these fake news debates here, there's an idea of ignoring the concept of a chain of rationality. You can deduce logical principles of how to live from facts, like from knowledge of how disease spreads, you can deduce health policy, and I don't think the rational chain of deduction is being acknowledged enough. It's like there's facts, and then there's just kind of making stuff up and thinking around things. And there is a rational chain of deduction that you can do.
So I've got a very quick comment and then a quick question. The comment is to Steve. You mentioned Martin Luther nailing his theses to the church door. I'm not sure if you're aware, there's a massive movement within history now that actually seems to say that he never actually did that.
No, that's
so
why
that
supposedly.
is fake news.
No,
Fake
I've got a piece on this. Don't worry, it's fake news. I know, that's your punchline.
And then the question is for you, Andrew. You sort of spoke in your initial pitch about how you want to separate sort of subjective beliefs and ideals from our access to logic. And as Barbara alluded to, something like memory has actually been shown to be very fallible. There's a lot of work with people like Elizabeth Loftus that have shown, something like memory can be entirely false. And I think it kind of is part of this whole movement within neuroscience and psychology that is showing that we are not sort of irrational, logical creatures, and many aspects of our cognition and many aspects of our perception are actually affected by our subjective beliefs and ideals. And so my challenge to you and Barbara, I'd love to hear your opinion on this, is how is it that sort of this access to logic, this rational part of us, is somehow separate from that? How is it that it's not somehow affected by a subjective bias?
Could I challenge one of Steve's point? As far as I understood, you have said that all kind of debates, even about things which we debunked previously, these debates benefit democracy. I work in theoretical physics, and I can see how debates about things like string theory or quantum theory of gravity benefits society and science in general. But I don't see how debates about creationism benefit democracy or actually anything. It's just a waste of time. We might as well debate about moon being made of cheese.
So we're going to take two more, then I'm going to come back to you for some thoughts, and then we'll go out for one final round. But yes, go on.
I'm trying to understand why are we so obsessed with this discussion now. For example, you mentioned Trump, but George Bush invaded Iraq based on something which was a lie. Bill Clinton said oral sex is not really sex, which is obviously not true. Soviet Union every year was saying we are producing X amount more steel or ham than last year, obviously true. Obviously not true. And if we take it to the epistemological level, it's not that relativism is a new thing. It started in our universities in the 60s, the 70s, and is based on ideas of previous centuries. So is it that this time, and since 2016, we are suddenly so concerned about relativism and truth? Or is it that suddenly our team in politics is losing, for example, and we want to find a way to kind of find an excuse for that? So, yeah, the question is why this obsession with post-truth now, where lies have been in politics and in our universities for decades or not for centuries? Thank you.
I thought the first person was very interesting on the echo chamber effects, because I think the strongest argument against what I'm saying, in terms of what I'm advocating, is the fact that in this kind of open environment where there's all this more information than ever before and people have to make decisions, there is this tendency, because of the way in which the internet is structured, that in fact people are being reinforced to just follow the same views over and over again. So in a sense, the opportunity that's presented by being able to choose between different points of view is kind of lost, you might say. And this is where we want to think about how our technology is actually organized to actually enable it to fulfill its full democratic potential. So I think the echo chamber issue is a serious issue to take on board. Also, there was this point raised about, Trump changing his, changing what he says every day from true to true to true, true, false. To be honest with you, I don't think this is a problem of well, what should I say? There's a sense in which people are actually a lot more tolerant of that kind of thing. And I think there's a kind of a deep kind of psychological issue there. In other words, because, and I would say the part that we're to look at is the fact that we change our minds every day, right? In a sense, Trump is kind of like the people in this regard, right? He doesn't pretend to be a different kind of person. He's like the people out there, like us actually, who do change our minds every day and change what's true and false and so forth. And I think that's a natural consequence of the fact that we actually have active democratic participation. Now, what you do about that fact, given that we're here, is an interesting question, right? Because it's not like I completely endorse this, but I don't think there's anything terribly mysterious going on. Trump is acting in public the way people act in private.
I want to make a quick corrective about fake news again. George W. Bush did not lie his way into Iraq. George W. Bush relied on faulty intelligence, which his administration then oversold to make the case for the war, but there were non-WMD reasons that he went into. Again, I think the project has turned out not as well as anyone had hoped, but it's just not correct to say George W. Bush lied his way into Iraq. But to the larger point, I think part of the reason why Trump is reacting and proposing himself on Twitter the way he is, and I say this as someone who supported Hillary.
You did?
Again, although I was, I'm as truly conservative and as anyone I think in this room. But I just thought that he's too erratic and not fit for office. Nevertheless, I also see a dynamic that began, by the way, as far as I could tell, maybe that's because I came into political adulthood around that time, with the press in the United States. I worked at the Wall Street Journal for 5 years. There is such a bias toward the left in the U.S. among the media. And it's gone into a kind of hyperdrive since Trump has been elected, where, for example, I'll just show you one example of fake news about Trump that I discovered and tried to counter. And you can multiply it by so many daily, partly because it all happens so quickly on Twitter, where Ivanka Trump had proposed a women's entrepreneurial fund that would be managed out of the World Bank. The media took that, just one person took an article, it was a legitimate article in the Wall Street Journal that described this as such, but then various people in the media said, isn't this just like what Hillary did, because Saudi Arabia, among others, is donating to, quote, Ivanka's fund. Now, there was no Ivanka fund. It's not like she was managing it, overseeing it, doing anything like that. She had just proposed to the World Bank, why don't we start this fund? And then Saudi Arabia came and put down 100 million or whatever. It was nothing like some of Hillary's relationships with unsavory foreign governments. Nevertheless, so that spiraled out, and thousands of people kept resharing it, mostly people with blue check marks, journalists saying, just like Hillary, Ivanka Trump took money from the Saudis. And so that's what I mean, that he's reacting in a way, he's throwing out so much garbage, I don't know, but to misdirect them, and it throws off the press, and the press constantly falls for it by sometimes going too far in how they cover him in manifestly unfair ways, like that Ivanka Trump fund.
Okay, I'm going to take Tim in very quickly, and then I'm going to come out for one last round of questions. So, Tim.
Steve, I think you've mischaracterised me as someone who's opposed to people being able to freely express their feelings in public debate. That's not what I'm getting at all.
How about, but isn't that, but for you, feelings is separate from opinions, right?
Well,
That's the problem.
no, not exactly. No, you can sort of separate them, not in practice, possibly sort of methodologically, but certainly not in practice. I think people can make passionate cases for something. People can make a passionate case for democracy in terms of Brexit. People might be able to make a passionate case for the EU, but, I struggle sometimes to imagine feeling passionate about the EU. So you can make a passionate case, but the ability to argue with someone who makes a passionate case, you always have to have, almost like a shared language. You have to be able to take that argument on its own terms. There has to be some notion that passionate argument is rational. The bigger problem with feelings, I think, is the way in which feelings have become, or an individual's feelings can become the sole authority, or the sole way in which a viewpoint is authorised, and you should therefore not challenge a particular viewpoint because it will upset someone. And that is my problem with the use of feelings in political debate.
I agree with you there.
Yeah, quickly, was it a chain of rationality? I think, yes, I think evidence should certainly inform certain aspects of health policy. Let's say certain fluids will spread disease, say there's a problem with tuberculosis, people should not spit on the street because that will spread the disease. I'm all for that. That's a piece of practical advice, but it's not a piece of moral advice. It's not really telling you something about the good life. It's not a vision of how you ought to live. And I think that's the distinction that should always be drawn out, that science and the facts cannot give rise to a moral system. It cannot tell you how you ought to live. Unfortunately, that is often how it's been used.
Okay, so I'm going to come out for one last round of questions. When I come back, I'm going to take Andrew and Barbara first, and then I'll give them all a minute to sum up.
A plea for nuances, really. I mean, I was struck by more than one speaker who seemed to conflate relativism with positivism. Straightforwardly, that's not the case. I mean, they're not relevantly similar whatsoever in their conception of truth or the objectivity of truth. In fact, they claim almost opposite things. But more broadly, I think to talk about this sort of epistemological situation of someone who's trying to get at truth is quite instructive here. I think that we ought to... I appreciated Barbara's remarks in terms of how it's entirely possible and desirable that we should be able to track truth through our beliefs. However, that's not going to be very easy. And there are things like psychological biases and various kind of psychological processes that make that difficult, and that's intensified rather than made easier through the fact that, as we've heard, you know, this is something that's social and happening amongst agents who are located in groups. I'd just like to hear a little bit more from people about sort of how they think objectively we can track truths given those situations and given those relevant limitations, because I think it's entirely possible. And I think we end up sort of straw manning the debate if we just say anyone who believes that such defects or limitations exist therefore denies objectivity. I don't think that's the case.
Well, it's actually a question to Tim, because you were saying that what we're seeing at the moment is an elite finding its sources of truth being questioned. And I was sort of struck by what Mr. Amari said, that the papal cyclical came out in 91, which was actually the time when we were also talking about the end of history. And it seems to me a bit strange that that was the time when people were beginning to get very, very worried. And how does that fit together with your point, Tim? Because it seems to me there were always several truths for the elite. And why do we have a situation at the moment when there should only be one truth? You know, there was always an elite which debated about different truths, and we don't have that anymore, it seems to me. We always have, you know, this one truth, and people very sure that their truth is the only right truth, you know, as you said at the beginning. So is there perhaps a link?
You just have to feel sorry for anyone who admits to you that their private life is like Trump's public life. So I think there's a misunderstanding as to the fact-value dichotomy, this idea that science can't inform moral values. Once you've decided that you care about the suffering or flourishing of conscious creatures, you're on your way. Science is nothing really that, I suppose, esoteric or unfamiliar or strange. It's just reason applied to the world. That's really all science is. The scientific method as such is sometimes used, partially used, but that's basically what it is. It's reason and evidence. And so that initial fact-value dichotomy is easily surmounted. Anyone who says that they don't care about the flourishing or the suffering of conscious beings is kind of out of the conversation. It might be a religious person telling you that this life is a vale of tears and it's best to suffer. It might be ISIS telling you that this is all good because it signals the end times. But other than those nutcases, we all have a foundation, I think, for agreement. As to the cognitive biases that everyone's been talking about, they're evolved.
Very quickly.
Very quickly. Rationality has evolved, and rationality was evolved for survival expedience. We use rationality in our interests. We don't use it to gain truth. That's why rationality evolved, and that's why those biases exist, like confirmation biases, my-side biases. Don't think that rationality was evolved to give us truth. It wasn't.
Barbara, is there anything that you wanted to pick up out of...
Yes, for both, and really excellent comments, so thank you very much for those. This is right in my area, because I have a book called Bad Moves, How Decision-Making Goes Wrong. And we make two kinds of decisions. We make what I call hot and cold decisions. And the hot decisions are the social and emotional and risky decisions. And if you put somebody in a scanner and you ask them to make some of those decisions, you can actually see it'll be the frontal lobes, but it's the orbital frontal cortex that lights up in this network, neural network, and that's sort of above and behind the eyes. When you ask somebody to make cold decisions, non-emotional decisions, you see activation again in the front part of the brain, the frontal cortex, but this time you get a neural network with dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. So we make both of those kinds of decisions, but the neural networks involved are slightly different. And they're very important that we have those because obviously we have to make social and emotional and risky decisions, and those are often time limited. And those are best done using the hot cognition, whereas making the more rational ones, we use the cold cognitive neural network. And sometimes, of course, if things get out of whack, we have to try to use our top-down cognitive control by prefrontal cortex over the emotional brain so that we don't lose sight of making the best possible decision, a good quality decision.
Okay, and Andrew, anything just very quickly, because then I'm going to bring everyone back in for 1 minute final summing up in the reverse order of what you spoke. So it can be you first. So Andrew.
I don't do anything very quickly.
This time,
I want
you're
to
going to
make
have to.
an epistemological point and a moral point. Have you guys seen the movie Courage Under Fire? You know, where Denzel Washington character is charged with responsibility trying to find out if the deceased Meg Ryan character deserved the Medal of Honor. And he's interviewing all these people who were there. They all give their different accounts. They often clash. And I think the filmmaker's point was the theme here is that truth is subjective. But what the film actually shows is that as the Denzel Washington character digs and digs and digs and digs, he finds out what actually happened. Some people are misremembering. Some people are lying, they get exposed, the misremember is remember, and he finds out what actually happened. The facts are here, and I think Barbara acknowledged that before. I may have a faulty memory, but it's faulty because, in fact, that didn't happen. And I think, one last point, is I'm one of the many people who've made the very courageous decision to go into intensive psychotherapy. I was not always the paragon of mental health you see before you today. And what we do in psychotherapy is we dig and look for what actually went down in my developmental years or the patient's developmental years, and you arrive at the facts. If you have the courage to face a lot of this stuff coming out of a crazy family, you arrive at the facts of what actually happened. Morally, very quickly, we need a standard of value. We need to answer that. Every one of us needs to answer the question, good by what standard? Our political judgment don't just require facts, like in the example before about the Soviet spies, but is this good or bad? We need a standard of value. To me, I agree with Ayn Rand, the standard of value is that which factually promotes human life. But we need, all of us in our own mind rationally, need to decide as a thoughtful process, what is good and what is evil, and good or evil by what standard? Then the facts can be assessed in accordance with our standard of value. We could decide, I'm not voting for Trump, I didn't, I think he's evil. I'm not voting for Hillary, I didn't, I think she's a witch. I voted for Gary Johnson, he's only weak. He's not evil, he's just a weak candidate. So he's going to do less harm than these two other bastards. You know, that was my
Okay, on that note, so final 1 minute, literally 1 minute, because we're running out of time.
Yes,
so.
Very quickly to the person who pointed out, I did sort of lump positivism and relativism together correctly as part of the litany of modern errors, but I take your point, that they're distinct. But to a larger point, I guess I'll, in a way, answer the gentleman who said, other than religious people, everyone else agrees on an idea of the good life. I will only say that scientific progress has not always equated to moral progress. In fact, scientifically advanced societies could be profoundly immoral. So there's no reason to believe that a society, because it can pinpoint the age of the universe, therefore also it will uphold human dignity in all stages of life. That those two can be often dangerously opposed.
Okay, thank you very much. So Barbara, your just final 1 minute of final thoughts that you'd like people to go away with.
Well, I just want to say I had a great morning, and I want you all to do what you're doing now, which is keep your minds open and have that battle of ideas with yourself and other people.
Okay, thank you. Steve?
Well, the world we're living in is not going to, post-truth, even if the word disappears, becomes less faddish, isn't disappearing as a concept precisely because through the internet and the alternative ways in which people can get knowledge and information, they have more at their disposal and they're taking action through democratic processes. And so unless you plan to arrest this in the future in some fashion, then you have to think about a way of regulating or managing it in some kind of productive fashion so that people who do take the decisions are able and willing to live with the consequences of them.
Great, thank you. Andrew.
Truth can be painful. Not always. I mean, she loves me. That's a joyous truth. Right? She loves me not. That's a painful truth. But painful or joyous or neutral, we need to be willing to face the truth. I want to give a painful example for me: the racism in the world. You know, the brutal mistreatment of blacks in America, worse in Brazil. The ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and the simmering ethnic hatreds that go on in the Balkans, the Armenian genocide that the Turkish regime still denies, the Holocaust, we can go on with the examples. These are all real. And if I want to combat racism, as I do, I have to face an agonizing truth. There's a great deal of racism in the world. And it's heartbreaking in the 21st century that our brothers and sisters, you know, our fellow human beings, some of them are still maintaining this tribal mentality from thousands of years ago, that skin color matters, or what tribe I come from matters. You know, as a colorblind individualist, I find this truth agonizingly painful, but I have to face it. It's true.
Great, thank you very much. Tim, final word to you.
End of history is a useful place to start, if that's not paradoxical. That almost signals the moment in which you sort of enter this kind of era of spurious truth. That was the point in which we were meant to start living in the truth, you know, that all debates were over. This was a liberal sort of capitalist consensus, and all that was left for politicians and policymakers to do was simply to manage the system according to the best available knowledge and using those with the right technical competencies. And then, of course, this wonderful moment, I think, in 2016, where we sort of enter the era of post-truth. And this is where I do agree with Steve's comment right at the beginning, where he talks about now people are empowered to think for themselves. And I think that really is worth celebrating.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we thank all the panel, please?